Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me and welcome to Popular Albums versus Favorite Albums. So I've always been intrigued by what becomes popular versus what is someone's favorite. And after putting together a lot of top 10 album rankings, videos like that, I found out that my favorite albums are often not the popular ones. And I thought it'd be really cool here to do a rundown comparison of some of the biggest bands out there, their popular albums versus favorite albums. And we're going to see where that goes. I'm going to try to give you an explanation on that and talk about the differences and why I feel the way that I feel on it. And I think we'd have a lot of fun in what those differences are, because there's a lot of different things that go into why it might be someone's favorite versus what makes something actually considered popular, right? So we'll do that here. We're going to dive into it in just a bit. But before we start, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And if you turn on notifications, you're going to stay up to date on everything going on in the world of music, just like this with a video about popular albums versus favorite albums, right? So this here is actually considered part one of this. I'm going to kick off with the letter A here. I've got 5 bands to talk about, 10 albums that we're going to cover, and we'll compare the differences between what makes something a popular album versus a favorite album. So there will be a part 2 to this. Stick around at the end. I'll tell you who those bands are, and then keep an eye out for that second one that's coming up. But we're going to kick off here with AC/DC, arguably one of the biggest of all bands out there in the world. And what I think is definitely considered their most popular album, although I know it could be argued with one other one. We've got Back in Black from 1980, and yeah, I could have easily done Highway to Hell, but I'm going to talk about this one instead. Their 7th studio album. It has sold 25 million copies in the US, estimated 50 million copies around the world. Just that in and of itself suggests that it is their most popular album. But other than that, I mean, it is a fantastic album. This was the first album to feature new vocalist Brian Johnson, taking over after the death of Bon Scott. We still got, Malcolm Young doing some of his most amazing riffs, out there. And Angus is just on fire playing everything on here. It's got 3 of the biggest songs that AC/DC would ever record. Hell's Bells, the title track, Back in Black, You Shook Me All Night Long. But, arguably, or not arguably, I have personally heard every one of these songs on the radio. And so when I listen to this album, it's very much like a greatest hits to me, and doesn't have that album feel where I'm getting the hits and the deep cuts on it. And I think for me at least, that's why this one here is not my most popular, but I totally understand why this is the popular one. For me, I need to have those peaks and valleys. I need to have deep cuts, songs I don't know that can become favorites. And so usually it's other lesser known albums, the albums that maybe have the least amount of hits on it, that often become my favorite album. So my favorite album, part of that being the reason, and I'll get into some of the other reasons here in just a minute, is Fly on the Wall from 1985, their 10th studio album. And I know a bunch of you guys are like head slapping right now. You can't believe that I would say that, because I know a lot of people don't like the production or the mix on this album here. I don't know what they're talking about. Personally, I love it. I think it's fantastic. I don't have any issues with that aspect of this album. It was certified platinum in the US, so I mean, it was a successful album for the band. 4th one featuring Brian Johnson, but it was the first one to feature new drummer Simon Wright on it. And all in all, I think this album is a really solid album. It's got some killer classic sounding tracks, for me at least, like Fly on the Wall, Shake Your Foundation, Sink the Pink. But for me at least, I think the reason that this one here is my favorite is I've got these, very nostalgic feelings about growing up and seeing the Stephen King movie Maximum Overdrive, for which they used the AC/DC music in, and a lot from this album was in it. And then those songs on top of that appeared on the soundtrack Who Made Who, which was a very popular thing in 1986. So you got a repeat of this stuff. And I think that me hearing it that way in the movie, on the soundtrack, on this album, just sort of reinforced all of that for me. But like I said, it has some big songs on it, but not their most popular stuff, and thereby it doesn't feel worn out. And I think that's going to be a recurring theme for me, where a lot of the discussion on this is going to be where the popular album feels worn out to me, and these other ones do not. And that's what makes something a favorite for me versus maybe not for someone else. All right, so we're moving on to Aerosmith and what is arguably their most popular album, Toys in the Attic from 1975, their third studio album. It was definitely a breakthrough album, has the title track on it, plus other classics like Sweet Emotion, Walk This Way, which was then later covered by Run DMC. So in the biggest selling album by them as well, having sold 9 million copies in the US. The second biggest selling album for the band is actually Get a Grip with 7 million copies on it. So they do have albums in the two distinct eras of the band, the 70s versus the 80s or early 90s, and those two different sounds that are huge sellers for them. But this one here, outside of the hits, I'm not really a fan of this album. It just doesn't flow very well for me. The songs like Uncle Salty, You See Me Crying, and Big 10-Inch just don't flow for me. That was a cover of a 1952 classic song. And that's just me. Maybe if I'd grown up with this stuff, I would feel different. But for me, at least, it really breaks the flow of the album. So this isn't even having to do with the big hits being worn out on it. It's more the flow of the album that makes this one not be as popular for me, at least. So my favorite album by Aerosmith, and again, you're going to find a lot of this has to do with my age, when I came into a band, and the era for which was my introduction. My time frame coming in the 80s. So Pump from 1989 is my favorite Aerosmith album. 10th studio album from the band at the time. This one here's also sold 7 million copies, so right in line with Get a Grip. Huge comeback for the band, certainly. But this one here, differing from their 70s rock era, basically it's a glam metal album for them. A different, time and era and whatnot. Me growing up in the 80s and being into the glam metal, I'm going to gravitate towards that. Whereas if you grew up in the 70s, you're probably gravitating towards that. So growing up in different eras, when you were introduced to a band, whether or not the hits are worn out or not worn out to you, that sort of stuff, flow of an album, all these things are coming in play as to what makes the difference between popular versus favorite. And this one here had mega hits on it as well. They had 3 top 10 singles on the Billboard Hot 100 with Janie's Got a Gun, Love in an Elevator, What It Takes. But I just felt that the lyrics and the music really match up on this one. It's got, sexually charged lyrics with sultry music, socially conscious lyrics with dramatic music. So it was just a complete package for me. And again, I'm sure it has a lot to do with the era that I came into the band, but I love Pump. That's my favorite album by the band, and I will argue that one forever. Okay, next band up that we're going to talk about here is Def Leppard. And they've got mega albums in their career, having achieved some crazy selling milestones. So both of the ones I'm actually going to talk about could be argued as the popular album, but I'll talk about why I'm differentiating between these. So first up being Pyromania from '83, third studio album, which has sold over 10 million copies. I mean, that in and of itself is huge. This got to be a thing where Billboard had to create a sales award for it because some of these bands were achieving this. So it is the Diamond Sales Award, selling 10 million copies in the US. First album with Phil Collin, who I think is the one who really took the band to another level. He took over for Pete Willis, great guitar player, but Phil Collin is the one who really defined the sound of the band. I know there's people who feel like the first 2 albums are where it's at and this is where it falls apart, but this one here, arguably their biggest album and the one that doesn't get crapped on by critics or other fans of the band. People will usually any era of the band like this. So I'm saying this is their most popular in that regard. It's got Photograph, Rock Rock Till You Drop, Too Late for Love, Rock of Ages, Fallen. I mean, those turned up in Broadway shows. Those are all over the radio. It's heavily produced, more so than their first two albums, but it's not overly produced the way that people talk about their next album, Hysteria. Now, in 1987, my older brother gave me his Walkman and a cassette that he thought I would enjoy, and it was this, Def Leppard, Pyromania, which would make you think that for nostalgic reasons, this would be that album. But it's actually not. While I got into Def Leppard, it's the follow-up album, Hysteria 1987, that's my favorite, because this was my Def Leppard. This was the first new album from the band that came out since I had been introduced to them. This was not my brother's Def Leppard, it was my Def Leppard. So I went to it for that. But this album, in and of itself, the fourth studio album, huge. Actually even bigger than Pyromania, selling 12 million copies in the US and having more Billboard hits and all that sort of stuff. But a lot of people argue and dislike this album because they think that it's overproduced. Now, again, I talk about growing up in the 80s and my era coming into these bands. I love the 80s production. I love that overproduction that people rail against. It just clicks with me, right? There's a lot of people, obviously, that it did because this thing sold 12 million copies on it. And of course, it's got huge, huge hits. Pour Some Sugar on Me that crossed over from the gentlemen's clubs and the dancing ladies and all that sort of stuff to being a huge hit on the Billboard charts. Armageddon it. There's also Rocket and Animal and the song Hysteria and so forth. But then there's the deeper cuts on this album, like Love and Affection, Gods of War, which are awesome, and those got played on the radio. And this too sounds like a greatest hits. I put this on and I've heard every single one of these on the radio. Certainly back in the late 80s, you would hear that. And I love it. And that is one of the reasons that it actually makes it my favorite. Whereas, say, the Back in Black album from AC/DC, that is something that went against it. Different here. So it's not always the same things that determine it. And again, favorite albums is a very, very personal thing. I mean, that is going to always be a delineation, whereas popular might simply be based on album sales, radio hits, that kind of stuff. So, sometimes it's very hard to categorize, but this video here, definitely a very personal one in that I'm talking about my favorites versus what generally critics, band, sales, things like that say are popular. And this next one here, definitely going down that road because we're talking about Fleetwood Mac and their biggest selling mega album, Rumors. It's the most popular from 1977, their 11th studio album. Just crazy that it was the 11th album in their career. They'd had 10 albums before this. And the 10th one was a big one for them too, the self-titled first that had Lindsey Buckingham, Stevie Nicks on it. But this one, their second album, man, through the charts, 20 million copies sold in the US. It is one of the biggest all-time selling albums. Their second, as I mentioned, to feature Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks on this thing. But this one here is the rock masterpiece. And it's just got, mega songs on it like Dreams, which was sung by Stevie Nicks, and Don't Stop, sung by Lindsey Buckingham. Go Your Own Way, another one by Lindsey Buckingham. And it really does sound as fresh today as when it came out 45, 50 years ago, however long it has now been, 77. I mean, it's getting very near that 50-year mark at this point. But a fantastic album by the band. And no real reason that it doesn't rank up there. I'm not sure why, but again, I might throw this one into that idea of era. That is a 70s era album. The next one I'm going to talk about as my favorite Fleetwood Mac album, Tango in the Night, came out in 1987. Now, I do remember seeing these songs, the hits off of here, on MTV, but I was not a Fleetwood Mac fan until 95 to 97. Whenever The Dance came out, that's when I became a Fleetwood Mac fan. But there is some more connection to this album than this one from the 70s. So I do think a lot of that has to do with this was their 14th studio album, and it would sell 3 million copies in the US, so nowhere near what Rumors did a very popular album, but not the most popular by Fleetwood Mac, not the one that everyone references. You know, people are still having huge things break big on TikTok and stuff because they use a song from here. The song's, you know, Dream shooting back into the chart. The song Don't Stop being used in 1992 for Bill Clinton's inaugural election, you know, that he was, or campaign, I should say, for the presidency. You know, these things just brought Fleetwood Mac, they bring them back around. And those are songs from this album, so I understand why that is. But this one here, for some reason, clicks with me. I love every song on this album. And I do like that 80s production, but the song Little Lies, which was a top 10 hit, that one I remember from MTV, Big Love, was actually a song I found later on. That was a number 5 hit at the time, but I became a fan of that through the movie Elizabethtown, where there was a re-recorded acoustic version of it done by Lindsey Buckingham. And I actually had to look it up and see what it was. And so that brought me around to this album. It's actually the start of this album becoming my favorite album because of that. Everywhere was number 14 on the charts, and Seven Wonders went to number 19. Neither of those songs do I remember from back in the day, but songs that I really love now, and only looking up to find out that, whoa, they were actually big hits. But they're songs that clicked with me hearing the album, even though I didn't know those were hits for the band. But all in all, again, just a solid album start to finish, and it's probably the production value that makes this one the real reason that it clicks with me. All right, and the last band that we're going to talk about here out of the 5 that are, you know, for this first episode here is Journey, who has mega albums throughout their career. How do you define what is the preemptive ultimate, you know, popular album by the band? And I'm going to do it through 2 of the songs that are on the album itself, as well as sales. But Escape from 1981, 7th studio album, which has sold 9 million copies. I think that is their biggest selling album. This was also the first album to feature Jonathan Cain, and I think that's the reason that pushed this over. It was him coming into the band. He really brought with him a real radio vibe sensibility that the band had not had prior to this with Greg Raleigh. Greg Raleigh, an amazing keyboard player, but Jonathan Cain really brought with the band what they needed to excel in the 80s. And Steve Perry, I think, sings his heart out on this album. He Neil Sean, phenomenal guitar. I mean, it just all came together. And I love this album. It could easily be a favorite album for me with songs like Don't Stop Believin'. And that's another one of those ones that's like Fleetwood Mac rumored with Dreams and Don't Stop and stuff like that, where the song keeps getting reused in movies and TVs and in people's, you know, social media videos, and it's past the billion mark on Spotify, YouTube, all these different channels and everything, where it's now considered to be the most played song ever. I forget what the number is supposedly at, but Don't Stop Believing has achieved that mark, however they calculated it, I don't recall, but it was pretty crazy. And it's also got Who's Crying Now, which is another, you know, major hit of theirs, but it's got the song Open Arms on it, which has got to be one of the greatest, if not forever, you know, love ballads written by a band. And just a perfect album. But I think between the songs Don't Stop Believing and Open Arms, this here, and of course the 9 million in sales, is why this album is always going to probably be considered the popular album by the band. This next one from Journey is a huge seller and a big one too. You might even be able to argue most popular, but there is some distinctions between it. It's definitely my favorite out of all of their albums. And it was the follow-up album, Frontiers, from 1983. This 8th studio album, which went on to sell 6 million copies. So that not that far off from 9 million to 6 million. It's still a mega seller, more than most bands do. I mean, it's, you know, Tango in the Night, Fleetwood and the Mac, only 3 million in sales. This thing has doubled it there. So, right, sales, you know, huge thing like that. But in 1983, I was 6 years old when this album came out, and I was introduced to the album through my older brothers playing this on vinyl. And a lot of it has to do with that album cover. I was mesmerized by that. then seeing the back of the album with the band skydiving. So as a 6-year-old boy seeing this and hearing it and those sort of space age introduction keyboards on Separate Ways Worlds Apart bowled me over, and it has stuck with me ever since. And so I think for this album, a lot of it has to do with the nostalgia of it, more so than any radio hit or anything like that. Is great memories growing up with my older brothers playing this, and then years later discovering what that album was, and it has always stayed with me as my favorite album. But when I also look at it, sort of separating it from nostalgia, because nostalgia can only take you so far. One of the things that I love about this album that I don't think is achieved on any other Journey album is that this album rocks harder than most of their other albums. And so songs like Separate Ways Worlds Apart and my favorite song, Chain Reaction, that's on here, were rock songs. And before this, they were much more in the ballad territory. Not that I don't like those, but I love a good Journey album. And this one here is a fantastic album to drive to. I keep it in my car all the time. And so that in and of itself makes this one a favorite album. But like I talked about Open Arms off of the last album, Escape, where being one of the greatest ballads, the other one, Faithfully, that is my favorite of all the Journey ballads, and that being on here with those other rock songs, and then you throw in stuff like Send Her My Love, After the Fall, it just remains my all-time favorite Journey album. And there you go. I'll run through some of the most popular albums versus my favorite albums from these biggest 5 bands. And as I mentioned, there's going to be a part 2 to this. So we started with the A's and we ran through the J's in this, and I'm going to pick up in part 2 with Led Zeppelin. We're going to talk about Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, Pink Floyd, Van Halen. That's a really hard one because, again, like AC/DC, I could have picked any number of combination of albums. We're going to talk about one of my all-time favorite progressive rock bands, Yes. So we're going to do some really cool stuff continuing on, talking about popular albums versus favorite albums and what those differences are. So I hope you'll tune back in when I post that next iteration of this, the part 2 in the series. All right, everyone, let me know out of the 5 bands that we talked about today, what is either your favorite or I should say, just tell me what your favorite is, because I think we all know what are the popular ones, right? So let me know if your favorite is the popular or if you have another one entirely, or if you're weird like me and you love Fly on the Wall, which I know just drives some people absolutely batty. Wait till we get to Pink Floyd and you hear what my favorite album is. It blows most people's minds, but that's for another time. All right, everyone, take care, have a great one, and I'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.